Hello and welcome to Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics, the podcast dedicated to reviewing each and every one of the so-called Walt Disney animated classics in chronological order, looking to put to one side nostalgia and influence and try and review these films on their own merits, or in some cases their own lack of merit. My name's Ben and joining me as always is my good friend Liam. Liam, which film are we looking at this week?
I certainly hope everyone is ready to bust a move because this week we are looking at the stone cold classic that is 2004's Home on the Range, the last traditionally animated Disney film before the wave of computer animation took over. So there's a lot of pressure on this film to really stamp that legacy with a good finale. But before we can decide whether or not this film deserves a spot on the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics, first we're going to take a look at some of the production history of this film, along with reviewing our way through the events of the film before finally deciding not only whether we believe this film is truly an animated classic, but also which character in this potential masterpiece deserves the title of the sexiest character in Home on the Range. But to start us off then, Ben, what is your history with this film?
So as we've talked about on the last few podcasts, we're very much in the realm of films I remember coming out and actively not going to see. And perhaps more than any other film of the noughties, Home on the Range is exactly what you think it's going to be just by looking at the poster. So in some ways it has the best marketing imaginable. I have watched this film twice, and both of those times when doing watch-throughs of every animated classic, I really don't have a lot of strong thoughts or feelings coming to this film. There are ones that really make me angry or annoyed or I think are missed opportunities, and I don't feel that way with this film. How about yourself?
This film is really part of my very own Mandela effect, because when it came to revisiting all of the animated classics a couple of years ago, when I looked at the list, I don't think I'd even heard of this film before. It just completely disappeared off my radar. So after that initial watch of all the animated classics, today was only my second watch of this film.
So clearly one we're both very excited to watch and talk about then. So, shall we talk a little bit about the context in which this film was made?
Amazingly, it turns out that this film began its life back in those now infamous Gong shows of Eisner and Katzenberg. Mike Gabriel of Pocahontas fame wanted to adapt the legends of the American West, really. Something we've seen before from Disney in their oh-so-wonderful classic Melody Time? Honestly, all the package films blur into one, but we've got the Tale of Pecos Bill in one of them, which, to be fair, is a fairly fun little story that works well as a short in a package feature. And I think that clearly Home on the Range draws a lot of inspiration from that style and kind of really that spirit of storytelling and animation.
My personal feeling about this film is that it's a film nobody really seemed to care about. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there wasn't money thrown at it and talented people involved, but it just seems like something that was slapped together. Like, it didn't feel like this was a passion project for anybody. And you can throw talented people at something and they'll produce something okay, but if no one really cares about it, it's really hard to feel like this has a clear pitch. And I think the direction of this is significant because even some of the weaker films we've had, I feel for the most part you can give them fairly clear elevator pitch, right? So Treasure Planet definitely has its flaws, but I can tell you it's Treasure Island in space. Boom, you get what it's about. This film, the closest I can do is it's a western, but if instead of cowboys you had cows, I think that's what they're going for. But that's not really a main driving force in this film. That's just something they occasionally lean on.
I'm glad you've mentioned this, and I definitely think it's worth touching upon early. But throughout this film, there were moments where I just found myself asking, what is the purpose of this story? Things are happening, but what was the pitch? And I think instead, maybe taking one of the classic folk tales of the American West and starting from there would have been a better idea. Because however much I will prefer an original story, it needs to at least have a coherent story for me to prefer. This just seems to be a series of events One thing that is immediately noticeable about this film is that I feel it skews a lot younger in its target audience than we've really had in a long time. From this era of Disney, we've had things like Atlantis and Treasure Planet, which are clearly staking their claim to the kind of pre-teen, early teen audience, where maybe you don't want to take your younger children to go and see it. And then we've got films like Lilo and Stitch and Brother Bear, which, whilst they can be enjoyed by really audiences of all ages, they're dealing with some quite heavy topics, and there's some depth there that might go over the heads of younger viewers. I feel that with Home on the Range, whether you are 5 or 50, you're getting the same thing out of it. And I think that's because they set the bar quite low. Before we dive into the plot, I just want to point out, as always, I was watching this on Disney Plus, and when you type in home into the search bar on Disney Plus, Home on the Range, the only animated classic with the word home in it, was 7th on the list. Behind classics such as Raven's Home, Homeward Bound, Wendy Wu Homecoming Warrior, Homeward Bound 2, Home Alone, and Home Alone 3. It does, however, appear before The Sandlot, Heading Home. So really, this is a film that Disney are very proud of and want front and centre on their streaming service, along with classics like Aladdin and The Lion King.
Weirdly, in my collection, which is just the animated classics, I still somehow found Homeward Bound 2 before I found this, which is very unusual. Let's get started then. So, we have an opening song, and I'm just going to say it. I quite like the songs in this film. Music's done by Alan Menken, and there's some good vocal performances. I think a lot of them are quite catchy and stick in my head. You know what? I quite like them.
I feel that we've hit a point where Alan Menken is the John Williams of Disney, where even on a bad day with a poor pitch, he's going to turn in something that, frankly, is very listenable and quite catchy.
I totally agree. We get 2 songs near the start. The title song, Home on the Range, and also shortly afterwards, A Little Patch of Heaven, which I have had stuck in my head after watching this film once, which is a testament to how catchy it is. We do get a very loose setup, basically. Our main cowtagonist, Maggie, is a prize-winning cow.
Ben,
she's on a farm.
I'm going to stop you there. I watched this film earlier today. I cannot remember a single character's name. I remember all of the actors for some strange reason, but if you told me to name a single character, I don't know who you're talking about. So, for my benefit, can we just refer to the main cow as Roseanne, please?
So, Roseanne, the prize-winning cow, lives on a farm, and all the other cows have been...
Cow-napped.
Cow-napped. Thank you. All the other cows have been cow-napped, except her for no adequately explored reason. Don't worry, we'll never come back to it. And the very, very first joke in this film is zooming in on her from behind, and a close-up shot of her udders, and her saying, yes, they're real. I don't feel that's an appropriate joke for any film, let alone a film aimed at children.
This was the moment I realised I was not going to get along with this film.
The very start of it. That was the moment when you realised. I realised when I looked at the poster, actually, so I can't criticise you for that.
Speaking of the poster, we forgot to mention, but not only does it have the wonderful tagline of Bust a Moo, but right at the top it says, from the Academy Award-winning studio that brought you The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. So they're really trying to milk that brand prestige of theirs and just slap it on. It's like with Blumhouse at the moment with horror films. If you slap Blumhouse onto a horror film, you also tend to bring up the better films they've produced, like Get Out. And the end film will have nothing to do with that or be nowhere near the quality of Get Out. But because it's the same production company, they can slap their name on it and hope that the name recognition gets you in. And they're really banking on that with our Buster Mooing Home on the Range.
I mean, imagine if Britain did that and it was like, from the makers of Shakespeare and the Industrial Revolution, we give you Brexit or Prince Andrew. Like, it's just shameless. I'm not going to dwell too much on the plot of this film because the film certainly doesn't. But basically, Roseanne the cow, she gets sold and she moves to Little Patch of Heaven, which is a farm that seems determined to fail. It's owned by an old woman who refuses to sell any of her animals because she's like, no, you don't sell family and these animals are my family. And that almost makes sense were it not for the fact she keeps pigs, because Pigs don't produce anything. We only eat pigs.
I was wondering about this when I watched it, because the farm is a dairy farm, so I understand why
With
you
3
wouldn't...
cows.
Well, it has chickens as well. She produces
They're
milk.
not dairy.
Eggs are dairy.
What?
Does that not count? I thought dairy was like the word for animal products that aren't lethal.
That's the word for milk? Like, I thought it was like for milk and
Milk,
lactose
eggs.
containing products.
And I suppose honey.
Tell us in the comments what dairy means.
I suppose honey as well by my definition.
I've derailed you. Go on.
So the farm is a dairy farm. And I was like, okay, that makes sense. It's got cows, it's got chickens, various animals that produce various animal products. It also has a goat, which is a male goat, so you can't milk it. I don't know why a goat is there. I suppose it just collects cans for her. It does a bit of recycling. But then there's pigs. And you're right, there's a moment later where the sheriff says, hey, you've got some of the best livestock in the area. Just sell some of your animals and you can save the farm. And she says, no. And it's like, just sell the pigs. It's not hard.
Also, she doesn't have any plan B, right? So they say, we're going to close you in 3 days unless you give us this money or sell your cows. And she just says, nope, that's not my style.
I'll figure something out.
But then she doesn't try and figure anything out. She just sits there and does nothing. I mean, I'm looking at my notes here. Here are my next 3 notes. Who is this for? What's going on? So much is happening and none of it means anything.
So we've glossed over our other 2 protagonists. Alongside Roseanne the cow, we also have a cow played by famous actress and poker player Jennifer Tilly. And for some bizarre reason, a cow played by Academy Award-winning actress Dame Judy Dench.
York's own Dame Judy Dench. I just don't know what to say about this. I mean, she doesn't exactly phone it in, but she just doesn't really have anything to work with. Genuinely, I don't know how to describe the personalities of these 3 cows. I will concede they are different, but I couldn't tell you what any of their gimmick is meant to be. One of them wears a hat.
My next note is literally, Ben, can you describe any of the 3 characters of these cows? Because I can't.
I looked on Wikipedia to see how they describe it, and they describe Roseanne the cow as sort of brash and a bit obnoxious. Again, it's weird because sometimes she's like burping and like doing stupid stuff with the pigs, but also she's meant to be like a prize winner and kind of a bit hoity-toity and above them. They can't decide which way to go with it. Judy Dench is just... I mean, it's just Judy Dench playing a cow. That's all I can describe it as. And Jennifer Tilly's, again, they do a little bit of stuff as she's kind of quite new age and like, hey, let's talk this through, let's get in touch with our spiritual side. But that doesn't really go anywhere. That's just...
I didn't notice any of that.
She's tone deaf, which is a key plot point. I will give them that. And she does a genuinely very good job of singing famous songs with the wrong notes, which is much harder to do than you think it is. So I'll give her props for that. That is genuinely impressive.
I wish I could remember the source of this, but when you're creating a character, you're supposed to have sort of several ideas going on. And one of those ideas is kind of a twist or a gimmick. And that's all there is to these characters. There's no depth here. And the traits we've mentioned, other than the tone deafness, don't really have any bearing on the plot or the character's motivations. They're so two-dimensional and simplistic that there's just not enough here for our protagonists.
Our cowtagonists.
Our cowtagonists. I think there's a little bit going on where Dame Judy Dench cow seems put off by Roseanne Barr cow and she doesn't like her for some reason, and there's never really any reason for it or any purpose for her disliking them. The big problem is that they don't spend enough time together before the plot starts, where what the plot is that due to all the cattle wrangling, the bank is calling in all of its debts, which means all of the farms in the area are being foreclosed and no one can afford to keep them, so they're going to auction. And Patch of Heaven is next. The farm needs $750 or it will go to auction. The owner of the farm has no idea. She's going to sit in her house and go about her day as normal. And Roseanne Barr cow decides, hey, you can make a lot of money at the fair. Also, whilst we're there, we can butter up the Cuba Gooding Jr. horse and he can convince the sheriff to delay the bank foreclosing on the farm. It makes no sense.
They really overestimate how much influence the sheriff's horse will have on a bank manager. And to be fair, when they try that later on, he's like, no, what are you talking about? Just on a side note, this economy's not going well, is it? Because all the ranches are closing, so the bank's calling in all its debts, which means the bank's going to collapse. I've been watching a lot of videos on economics lately.
Well, weirdly enough, I think that's part of the villain's plan. It's just not paid much attention to. He just kind of wants to own everything, it later turns out. Jumping ahead, but there's not much there anyway, so it's fine. I kind of glossed over the Cuba Gooding Jr. horse. I quite like him, but again, it's so one note and two-dimensional. He's just kind of headstrong and a bit of a hotshot and determined to prove himself. But really, all of the characterization comes from the frankly very good performance, and that's it.
So yeah, Cuba Horsing Jr. is wanting to be a kind of Western hero, and he wants to beat up the bad guys and stuff, and he looks up to Rico, who's the sort of badass bounty hunter in town. We also establish all the cattle is being wrangled by Alameda Slim, who is the villain for the piece, for what it's worth. And yeah, and then there's a lot of faffing. So when they go to town, there's a lot of faffing, but it highlighted for me one of the reasons a lot of this doesn't work, because the animals aren't seen as behaving like animals to the humans, but they're still animals, if that makes sense. So, as far as the human characters in this film are concerned, like, cows are cows. Like, they're stupid and they don't really know what's going on, and same for horses, right? Like, that's how these characters see those animals. But then when they look out the window and the cows are, like, wrestling each other and the horse is, like, running across a roof to show you how awesome it is and doing press-ups, that's what they're seeing. What? Like, so they're seeing a horse doing press-ups and like, stupid horse doesn't know what's going on. It's weird.
This is a world in which all of the animals are very eccentric and nobody bats an eye. The cows just walk into town and nobody bats a fucking eye.
But then, on the flip side of that, then after the cows have been wrestling for too long, the sheriff goes, what's going on here? And he thinks they're linked to some sort of cattle rancher. So he ties them to his wagon so they can be taken away. So that's like a normal thing to do when you see lost cows. But as you say, no one questions them wandering in or wrestling or trying to become bounty hunters.
The wrestling itself is absolutely bizarre. This is the epitome of a cul-de-sac joke where the cows are running into town, they see a star, which they assume is the sheriff's office, they go in, it turns out it's a saloon run by a woman who at first I thought was a reference to Angela Lansbury, but apparently is voiced by and based off Ann Richards, the governor of Texas in the 90s.
Okay. Kids will like that.
And because it's a Western, there's going to be a saloon brawl. And that's the joke. It's just a big extended slapstick sequence. And then the cows go outside. And you can cut it from the film and nothing changes.
What this film made me realise is I'm willing to bet 99% of people listening to this or even watching Home on the Range have seen more Western parodies than they've seen actual Westerns, at which point parodying it becomes pointless.
Back to the plot then. You mentioned Alameda, it's Randy Quaid. You mentioned Randy Quaid, the cattle wrangler, who is our villain of the piece. Randy Quaid really digging deep here to play an outlaw on the run from the American authorities, who has been rustling cattle in the area and stealing them all. He's the source of all the problems, and he's the last bounty left, and his bounty, conveniently, is $750.
I almost like Randy Quaid Slim as a villain. I don't get me wrong, but there's a nugget of a good idea here. Like, he's got a reasonable motivation. So basically, we established that his talents were overlooked by ranch owners and he wasn't utilised, so he's stealing all their cattle and buying out their foreclosed farms. And he's not doing it because he wants money or he is trying to force someone into marrying him. He's just doing it out of revenge. And I was like, this is almost a good motivation.
He is arguably the strongest character in the film. And I would also say he's definitely my favourite performance in the film, which is the only time I think I've ever said that about Randy Quaid.
We also get a moment shortly after this. So the cows and Rico and Cuba...
Can we talk about Rico quickly? because there's something potentially significant here in that Rico, who is the only character I know by name, by the way.
He's the only character who frequently gets referred to by his name.
So Rico is this badass bounty hunter who Cuba Gooding Jr. looks up to and wants to be the horse of. And he shows up.
Just remind you, Cuba Gooding Jr. is a horse in this film.
And Rico shows up, and he's so obviously villainous that at a later point it is revealed that he is in on it. Spoilers for Home on the Range, however will you cope. And it's not a huge spoiler because he's not really enough of a character for it to be a twist. But what I'm wondering is this Disney's first twist villain?
Ooh.
Which is a trope that is pretty much the norm now. You don't have the traditional Renaissance villain anymore. You have a twist. There will always be some kind of flipping on its head. And is this the first case? We have what I consider to be the first proper case coming up shortly. But I'd forgot about Rico, because he's just not really a presence in the film. But is he technically our first twist villain?
I guess it depends how much of a twist we're calling, because there's a case to say Rourke in Atlantis has some breadcrumbs of that, in that he's not presented as a villain per se for the film, and he does do some heroic things, but at the end of the day, that's his motivation. I think Rico might be a better fit. We're told explicitly he is a hero, and he does heroic things.
I think you're right, actually. I think Rourke would have to be considered it because he's part of the team, and it's a reveal at the midpoint. I suppose the difference with Rourke is it's revealed, as I say, at the midpoint of the film rather at the climax, which is what is happening at the moment with Disney twist villains.
So the three cows, Rico riding Cuba Gooding Jr., head out after Aliquator Slim and...
Question.
Go on.
The cow's plan then is to capture Randy Quaid, claim the bounty, and save the farm.
Yes.
Let's roleplay for a second. You're a sheriff of a small town in the American West.
Yeehaw. I'm not doing an accent or any enthusiasm, but I'll say yeehaw.
Your last bounty is for a notorious cattle rustler, and one day, 3 cows show up carrying him tied up. Do you give the cows the bounty?
I mean, obviously not. Not only would I not give the cows the bounty, I'd be like, well, I've saved myself some money paying this bounty out, and I've got 3 cows.
The reason I'm mentioning this is because, really, I suppose what the elevator pitch is 3 cows want to claim a bounty. But at no point do I ever believe in that. So I'm just kind of watching it going, okay, how is this going to resolve? Rather than rooting for them.
I mean, the answer in how it resolves, Liam, is off camera, because at the climax of the film, the 3 cows crash a train into Randy Quaid, and his disguise just falls off, and then he's arrested by the sheriff, and then we cut forward and everything's fine. So, who knows what happened there? I expect cleaning the train up probably cost some money. So sooner or later... It feels like later. The cows end up in a cow herd, and Alameda Quader shows up to rustle them. The way he does this is interesting because he's this huge guy and he looks really menacing, and then he gets out a little ukulele and starts yodeling. And I was like, is this a good twist? Is anything good? I don't know anymore.
I will say that this song is probably the highlight of the film for me. I think the song is very good. I think Randy Quaid's singing is surprisingly good. I think that's actually him yodeling, which is genuinely wonderful. However, the actual sequence and the choreography of it is so flat. We kind of just zoom out and there's these hundreds of 3D models of the bulls that are just repeated, and it's just a palette swap with the music changing colour, and they do this kind of snake dancey, but there's often a black background, almost reminiscent of parts of Pink Elephants, but without any of the creativity. It almost feels that the black background was a placeholder because when using the 3D models, they couldn't also do a traditionally animated background and have the pan shots that they wanted. So they were just like, fine, we'll just have it take place in a void. And it just kind of reeks of laziness and uncreativeness.
I think that's a very fair summary of it. I feel there's a lot more scope to do stuff with hypnotised cows and yodeling than we necessarily get. And there's a weird side thing in this song where his 3 nephews, who are all identical, keep commenting on how fat he is. And like, we talk on this podcast sometimes that we like songs in musicals to... There's been a journey at the start of the song and you've gone from point A to point B throughout the duration of this song. And this song needs to show that cows are easily hypnotised by this guy's yodeling abilities and he's fat. Like, those two things don't seem connected.
I think that the size of his trousers is used as a punchline 3 times throughout this song. Not just that he's fat, specifically the size of his trousers.
And I'm going to say it, he's actually quite slim in the waist. It's his torso that's quite big.
He's a big, muscly brute. It's a really good character design.
Well, let's not say things we're going to regret later. So, as I say, we get a little bit of a twist of Jennifer Tilly Cow is completely tone deaf. She says she's got perfect pitch, but she's tone deaf, so it doesn't work on her, and she manages to snap the others out. There's a lot of hijinks and flim-flammery. At one point, shortly after this scene, and I can't remember the exact moment, but Jennifer Tilly sort of psychoanalyzes someone and says, definitely bipolar, and I was like, that's not a good thing to just have someone casually say in a film as a joke.
Is it with Cuba Gooding Jr.?
I think so, yeah, I think so.
Because what happens is Randy Quaid leads all the cattle into a ravine and then causes a landslide. It's quite exaggerated and comic. Really, the whole film is very wacky and Looney Tunes-esque, which is very strange to be seeing from Disney. But like I say, they did this kind of stuff back in the package films, so it's not as if they don't have a history of it. It just feels so jarring after the Renaissance. So Randy Quaid has led all the cattle away, and Rico, riding Cuba Gooding Jr., shows up, and Cuba Horse is showing off to the cows how he's going to be the one to catch Randy Quaid. And in one of the few jokes I quite like, Rico just looks over, sees the horse doing all this strange kung fu, and says, that horse is skittish around cows, take him back. Which leads us now to another character arc, which is now Cuba Gooding Jr. Horse wants to catch Randy Quaid on his own to prove that he's a good bounty hunter and can be, as a result, be a good bounty hunter's horse. There are so many threads going on in this, and none of them are significant.
And again, I feel that's almost what they should have leaned into. It should have been almost this sort of Shakespearean farce of every time you think it's got as ridiculous as it's going to, there's another layer added. That's kind of one of the reasons The Emperor's New Groove works, right? Is that every time you think something's happening, they add another stupid thing to it. So they're on a bridge that's collapsing, and then they're fighting, and then they are getting attacked by scorpions, and then there's bats in their face. Like, everything they do is just leveling up that farce, whereas this, it just feels distracted more than escalated.
I would say it's because there's no farce to this. It's just throwing elements at the plot, but nothing is particularly funny or raises the stakes in any way. Stuff is just happening.
Was that a pun on cows?
It wasn't.
I apologise for nothing. Okay, so we do get, around this scene, we get a joke that I genuinely think is funny and does work. So we get Randy Quaid just telling his minions what his motivation is and what his plan is, because we need to know it as an audience. And there's a joke where one of these triplets is just sat on the sofa watching them all faff about, and then when he moves his head, there's a outline on the map of the little patch of heaven farm that's exactly the same shape as his head, and he's always been sat there whenever they've been in that room, so Randy Quaid hasn't noticed it. I was like, that's a genuinely good joke. I'll give you that one, Home on the Range. And that's the end of my praise for the film.
One thing that's really strange as well, after that, frankly, as you say, very good joke that actually works, we then cut back to the farm, and we kind of have this sad moment where all the animals are like, oh no, the cows have abandoned us, and there's no way for us to save the farm, and everyone's sad. And we're supposed to feel something for the denizens of this farm, but I feel absolutely nothing, because we've not spent enough time with any of these characters. All we needed was 10 minutes at the start showing Roseanne Cow adapting to the farm and winding up Dame Judy Dench Cow. Similar to, in fact, a much better version of that arc is the Toy Story one, where Buzz moves in and Woody has his place in the room challenged, and we see it happen. Yeah, we actually see it over a montage. It's very efficient, but it works. Give us that with Roseanne Barr Cow and Dame Judy Dench Cow, and have the rest of the denizens of the farm involved, so that when we cut back to them, we're like, oh no, they're going to lose the farm. I feel sad for them. Instead of, oh yeah, there's a farm.
I have 2 notes on this section. So the midpoint action sequence of this film is some cows being rained on. And the physicality of this film is such that that is an action sequence. And then, as you say, we get this song, and it's called Will the Sun Ever Shine Again? And I was like, oh, this is very good. But actually, I genuinely think this is quite a powerful, emotional song. Like, I think the vocal performance is strong. I think the song is good. I looked it up. It was written in response to September 11. So I don't think this is the best use of this song, because it's meant to have a really emotional impact, but I'm very limited in the emotional impact I can have when the visuals I'm presented with is a woman thinking about cows.
That's genuinely awful that Alan Menken's response to the 9/11 attacks ended up being used in this film. You mentioned the rain, and this goes back to pretty much all of my points about Dinosaur, which is you cannot have an engaging action set piece with quadrupedal animals. The most you can do here is they're following some trails, it rains, and then it turns into a flash flood. And oh no, the cows are going to drown, they have to get to higher ground, and it's like, oh okay, this is exciting.
But if that's true, Liam, why is The Lion King so good?
Because the core of The Lion King isn't the action, it's the emotional resonance with the characters and the story.
I think that's very fair, and I think even something like The Fox and the Hound, which we definitely had our problems with, but we both agreed the final sequence of Todd and Copper fighting a bear is really tense and really good. And I think it comes down to the believability of the physicalities of these characters, because these cows don't physically behave like cows. So it's very hard to feel like there's any danger when they just bounce off everything.
So the culmination of this is the 3 cows taking shelter and Dame Judi Dench Cow having a go at Roseanne Barr Cow, saying everything was fine until you came along. And as an audience, we haven't really seen any fault of hers. This is what I'm saying. It's really missing something at the start to put a bee in the bonnet of Dame Judi Dench Cow. Or a hat, I suppose, because we haven't mentioned she wears a hat.
That's literally her character trait. She wears a hat. Just on a side note, Dame Judi Dench Cow, it wasn't Roseanne Cow that caused all these financial problems. The farm would still be closing, irrespective of whether Roseanne Cow was there or not.
So they have an argument, and Roseanne Barr Cow decides that, fine, she's just going to leave. And it's so strange watching this film and going, oh, we're at that point of the narrative where our protagonists are at their lowest point. I don't know why we're there, but we are.
Because they got rained on. It's sad. It was a sad song about 9/11.
It's the strangest use of pathetic fallacy ever, where rather than the rain reflecting the lowest point, the rain is actively causing the lowest point.
It's just the lazy tropes of going, okay, we'll have the characters stood in the rain and looking sad, and we'll play a sad song, and then that will make people feel sad. But that's not really how anything works.
This is the point where I realised that this film was written by people who know what narrative structure is, but don't understand why it is what it is.
And it's actually a really important point, because if you're trying to do something subversive, which I think that's what Home on the Range is trying to do, I think it generally is aiming at a younger audience, as you say, but I think a lot of the jokes are meant to be sort of subversive and referential and sort of meta in that Emperor's New Groove Shrek mould. If you're going to break the rules, you have to know how to follow them first, and I think that's... I was going to say that's where it falls down. It falls down because all the jokes are just pop culture references that don't make any sense. At one point, they just reference a relatively obscure line from 1989's Batman.
Honestly, I think I hate this era of family filmmaking.
Let's move into our final act then.
What I love about this is our characters are at their lowest point, and the start of the third act is, generally speaking, usually one of the most interesting elements of your film. You have to turn things around for the characters and get them to the final confrontation. we don't even get chance for the characters to split off and go their own way. Like, think of in The Emperor's New Groove, where they fall out and separate, and then we only have a few scenes, but it's all we need of Cusco being on his own at his lowest point and then reuniting with Pacha. Here what we have is they go to bed angry and wake up and there's a rabbit there.
I'd forgotten about the rabbit. I hadn't even made any notes about the rabbit.
There's just this bizarre peg-legged rabbit who feeds all the cows and says, oh, my life was ruined by Randy Quaid too. Let's all work together. And it's like, okay, that's very efficient, but I suppose we're over our lowest point for our characters. And they set off to go capture Randy Quaid.
Which, faffing aside, they basically do without issue. They have this whole, oh, no, I need to stop at one point here. They have to get past the doorman, who's like a big sort of ox type thing. Cuba Gooding Jr. can't get past because he's a horse. He says only cows can go past. And when they get past, they're like, hey, Cuba Gooding Jr., screw you, horse, because you ran off without us. And Roseanne Cow does like that sort of sassy finger snap with her tail. And I was like, that can fuck off.
What can really fuck off is referencing and parodying club bouncers and the alleged discriminatory gender politics of club bouncers in a children's film. I don't understand what they're doing here. Because as I said, this film skews so young. Obviously, the children aren't getting this joke, but the adults, I suppose, are watching it and going, haha, that's just like trying to get into a club. Except it isn't, it's just the perverse, misogynistic myth of getting into a club.
And not to hammer on this too much, but I think that's where this type of humour fails, because for me, jokes for the adults aren't just referencing something that only an adult would understand, it's actually doing something funny. So a really good example for me is in The Incredibles, where Mr. Incredible puts on his super suit for the first time in however many years, and when he stretches, you see his stomach kind of bulge out, showing that he's middle-aged, he's put on some weight. And that's something that adults are going to identify with and laugh. Now, kids might be like, he's fat, and like that, but they're not going to kind of get the commentary on, hey, this is what having kids does to you. And it's a genuinely funny moment. It's not just Mr. Incredible referencing something from 20 years ago with no perspective.
That's the point I always want to come back to, is that a truly good family film may work on different levels for different audience members, but it's the same elements that are just being interpreted different ways. So yes, for children, you've got the physical humour of the large belly. There's physical humour involved, but also there's that personal element that the older audience members get. But it's the same joke being interpreted by two different sets of eyes. Whereas really what Shrek gave birth to is the humour that we need a joke for the adults, a joke for the kids, a joke for the adults, a joke for the kids. It's been 5 minutes since we've had something for the adults, let's put something in. And it's just lazy and terrible writing and incredibly cynical. Obviously, the perfect joke doesn't even work on two levels. No matter who you are, you're all getting the same thing out of it. Namely, talking about Winnie the Pooh here being an adorable little idiot.
So moving to the third act, Steve Buscemi shows up playing a version of Steve Buscemi. He's not even an animal, he's just a little caricature of Steve Buscemi being a conniving businessman who does nothing in this film other than be Steve Buscemi.
Patrick Warburton also shows up for 2 seconds, and as is often the case, he's one of the best things in the film, just by being Patrick Warburton.
So the cows trick Randy Quaid by stuffing their ears so they can't hear his yodeling because it's irresistibly hypnotic. There's a big minecart chase, and then we find out, shock horror, Rico is in Randy Quaid's employment, and the cows are imprisoned in a train, and Randy Quaid rides off in disguise to go and buy a little patch of heaven. And then, I don't have any notes, so I'm just going to assume there's some faffing.
We've basically hit the end of my notes as well, where the last 3 notes I have are, the cart sequence is okay.
Yep, I can vouch for that. It is okay.
Oh no, not Rico. And finally, the third act is acceptable.
Well, I'll just move right on forward then. So, to be honest, I think we've touched on it really. There's a bit of a fight scene with the various goons and minions. The horse fulfills his arc and hurts some people, probably kills them, let's be honest, if you've ever been kicked by a horse. And they crash a train and defeat Randy Quaid, and that's kind of the end of the third act.
There's a bit more to it than that. As I say, I think it's pretty acceptable.
Don't lie, Liam.
I think that the slapstick actually works here because it's relevant to the plot and there are stakes. So there's a part where our protagonists realise they're going to have to get to Piece of Heaven before the auction and try and stop Randy Quaid. And they realise, hey, we've got a train here. Let's use the train. So they just hijack the train and they're going incredibly fast. There's a nice little bit where there's another train that's coming right towards them.
By the way, you've designed your train track very poorly if that's how it works, because the train's going where it was already going. They've not changed the direction, so the planned routes involve two trains just having a head-on collision.
That was the dangerous days of the Wild West, I suppose. But yeah, there's a nice little tense sequence where Cuba Gooding Jr., horse, and the strange little rabbit have to run on ahead to change the direction of the tracks. They break the lever, they have to use the rabbit as the lever. It's nice, it's slapstick that works and has a purpose. And then, as you say, they get back to Little Piece of Heaven just as it's been sold off. They kind of have a showdown with Randy Quaid where the cows all attack him, all the animals on the farm attack and join in as well. Again, it would have had more of an impact if I cared about any of these characters. Again, I compare it to the end of Toy Story with the chase towards the moving van, and I know and care about every toy on the moving van, not just Woody and Buzz.
I'm not that bothered about Potato Head, he is an arsehole.
Speaking of Potato Head, I think Mrs. Potato Head is in this.
Oh yeah, she voices a chicken. I mean, to be fair, she does have the perfect mother hen voice, so I will give them that. That is a genuinely good idea.
But yeah, they beat up Randy Quaid, they throw him into the spout of the train, blow the horn, and it blows his disguise off, where he's like, ha 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 ha, you haven't stopped me, but they obviously have.
Well, this is it. So he says, like, but no cow can still resist my singing. Like, yeah, but several human beings are there watching this happen. So even if you hypnotise the cows, that is irrelevant because the sheriff is there.
I'm just picturing a hard cut from Randy Quaid singing We See the Cows, and then it just zooms out and shows him still stuck in the engine, the cows just prancing around, and all the humans just go, huh? Okay.
See, Emperor's New Groove would have done that, and does do that, in fact.
With Randy Quaid arrested then, I think the sheriff says, well, your cows don't have use of the bounty money, but I suppose you do. But it's good that the cows subdued him on the farm. Because as I say, like, if the cows just showed up with Randy Quaid one day, I wouldn't give them the money as the sheriff. I'd be like, okay, that's handy.
There's also a line where the sheriff says, I hope you like prison, to Alameda Slim. And I honestly thought he was going to be like, I hope you like being hanged, because that's what we do to cattle rustlers. And that's basically it. We then get a sort of flash forward sequence where Roseanne Cow and Judy Dench Cow are living in perfect cow harmony.
Well, yeah, there's a little bit of a fake out where they think that Roseanne Cow has left the farm because she said she was going to after everything was resolved, but then she's just in the background eating food, and it's like, okay.
It's the exact same moment as the end of the Jungle Book where Bagheera starts saying nice things about Baloo, and then Baloo's like, oh no, keep going. It's that exact same bit. And in fact, there's a bit where Randy Quaid is explaining to his nephews that when he's in disguise, he's a different person, because as soon as he puts the glasses on, they want to fight him and say, who is this? And it's just lifted from the Hello, Mr. Thompson sequence from Cape Fear in The Simpsons. Because I was like, oh, this is quite funny. And I was like, oh no, it's just stolen from that. They've come back from a fair as well, and they've all won first place. Now, I don't know how that works, because if they're all entered into the same category, how have they all come first? I'm calling shenanigans on this fair.
I think we get one last musical number. Everyone's happy. The farm is saved. And that's basically it.
But before Liam and I pass final judgments on Home on the Range and decide whether we think it's worthy of going on our own list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics, the creme de la creme list of animated films, Liam, is there anything else we need to talk about regarding this film?
Oh, bloody hell, there is one thing. We need to decide which character we think is the sexiest. As always, we're referring to any characters that we feel are inappropriately or unnecessarily sexualized in a children's animated film. And considering this skews quite young, I think they've done a pretty good of it being a very unsexy film.
Well, you say that, but I will remind you that we open with a joke about a cow's udders being real and not fake. That's a sex joke. It's just a bad one that's awful, and it's about a cow.
It's a very visually unsexy film, then, I suppose.
Oh, for sure.
The writing is just pure filth, though. So, Ben, who do you think is the sexiest character in Home on the Range, and why is it Cuba Gooding Jr. horse?
I don't know there is. I think you like this horse a lot more than I do. I actually have little to no time for the horse. I suppose if I had to go one way, it would be Rico, because he's not an interesting or particularly visually exciting character, but he's obviously based on the, Clint Eastwood. He's a Clint Eastwood style stereotype of gruff man of few words who's sort of grizzled and chiseled. So I guess I'll go Rico.
If Rico did a single set of push-ups in this film, I would be inclined to agree. But the only the only thing we get to see display any kind of macho-ness and gross masculinity is the horse. So I'm still going to stake my claim on the Cuba Gooding Jr. horse, who has a name, I'm sure.
I don't think he does.
So I suppose it's time that we need to decide whether or not this film deserves a place on the prestigious list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics. Now, listening to this, you might be getting ahead of yourselves, but procedure is procedure. We first have to retrieve the scroll. As we near the vault, we see the foreclosure sign that we've ignored for far too long, and will continue to ignore. As I open the vault to be greeted by all our farmyard friends, who are very excited at the prospect of potentially going on this list, and retrieve the scroll. Ben, do you think this film deserves a spot on the list of Waly Gisnep's animated classics?
Nope.
Well, I'm going to agree. I don't think it should go anywhere near it. The animals are heartbroken. Care to explain to this very sad-looking pig why he's not making the list?
There are several Disney films that I think are bad. And we've talked about them at length, and we will talk about them at length. Fairly soon, in fact, in future episodes. But films like Oliver and Company, The Black Cauldron, the package films, even things like Treasure Planet, which aren't a total wreck, but they're just not quite there. I can kind of see what they're going for, and I can see why. Even something like The Black Cauldron, which for me is a totally unwatchable car crash of a film, I can see that there is a nugget of something interesting in there. It's Disney going, we're going to do dark fantasy. They fail, but that's what they're trying to do. I don't know of anyone who likes this film. No one really seems to hate it. It seems to be an easy target and low-hanging fruit when you want to point to Disney doesn't know what the hell they're doing, or didn't know what the hell they were doing during the noughties. But it's not absolutely terrible, right? I would not say this is in the 3 worst Disney films that we've looked at, which is genuinely not what I was expecting. I think a lot of people would look at this and say this must be one of the worst. It's not a good film, not by any stretch, but there's some nice stuff in it. It moves at an okay pace. But yeah, it is definitely not worthy of going on the list.
To me, the problem is twofold. Firstly, as we've talked about, it's the pitch. I don't think the story is clear enough, and I do not think there is enough focus to fill out a feature-length film. I feel they had lots of very weak elements and just threw them in hoping it would fill the runtime, which I think may be a consequence of the style of humour they're going for here. This, to me, harkens back to your Looney Tunes cartoons, really. And I think that final set piece, from the train to the farm, is actually pretty good at that. The only problem is that I don't care about the stakes by that point in the film. I think this could work very well in a much shorter package. Or, my second problem with it, and potential fix, is just in the writing. I think the writing is very lazy and very poor. When we were talking about The Emperor's New Groove, which is an equally zany film, the writing is so sharp and it's constantly alternating between strong written jokes and strong visual jokes. I think this film has some strong visual jokes, definitely, but there is none of the strong writing to offset it. And I think like a Bugs Bunny cartoon or like a Tom and Jerry, it's great in short bursts, and any individual moment you can take and go, hey, that's a good visual joke. The cart sequence is wonderful. The joke about blocking the map genuinely is the strongest joke in the whole film, and it's entirely visual. But over 70 minutes, without the writing or the depth of characters to support it, I just do not care. So I actually disagree. I actually think this is one of the weakest films that we've seen so far. I think it really struggled to hold my attention for its full runtime, and it might be one of the most lazy and cynical entries from Disney that we've seen. I do not like this at all, and I don't want it going anywhere near the list.
But of course, those are just our views. Is Home on the Range one that you have fond memories of? Are the sharp, intense colours and pop culture references something that clicks with you? Or do you fall on the same side as myself and Liam and feel that, like most of the people in the world seemingly, this film is pretty bad? Or are you one of those people who's never seen it because you know what you're going to get when you look at the poster and go, this film isn't for me, I don't know who it's for? As always, we're very keen to hear what your views are on Home on the Range, and of course who you think the sexiest character in this film is. Of course, there's always more animated films to talk about, so Liam, which film are we going to be looking at next time?
Next time, Ben, we are looking at Disney's first foray into a completely 3D animated film. Obviously, we've seen the work of Dinosaur blending 3D models and live-action environments, but this is the first film in which Disney decided to compete with the likes of DreamWorks and Pixar before them, because we are looking at 2005's Chicken Little. Now, as of this point, this is a film I have only seen once, and I am very keen to revisit to see how it holds up.
Don't lie, Liam.
With that, all that's left to say is thank you very much for listening. We really do appreciate it wherever you choose to listen. Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics is available on Spotify and SoundCloud, as well as a special enhanced version on YouTube. If you are watching along with us, remember to give Chicken Little a watch and join us next time for Waly Gisnep's Animated Classics.
On a little patch of heaven way out west.